Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction, mercifully brief, and that meant that you left out the part about me being runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 to Vladimir Putin.
Well,
and I do need to point out one thing, though. I do actually do a few things other than a fellow at Yale, where I do lead a seminar on great power competition, but I've discovered that the highest calling in life after government service is the private equity industry. And I'm actually a partner at KKR. I've been there nearly for 11 years, and I chair the KKR Global Institute, which examines the geopolitical risk during the diligence process, and then also, as I said, part of the partnership as well. So, but again, thanks to the kind, it's really wonderful to be back. I think I was here about 8 or 9 years ago. Mm-hmm. I had a delightful time, and so I appreciate the return engagement.
General, on behalf of Sandhya and Marianne and everyone at the council and all of our members as well, it's an honor and a pleasure to host you again. Thank you very much for coming. 2024 is still open. I'm pretty sure Vladimir Putin won't win this year. But maybe we'll do what we can here tonight to get you in the running again. But tonight, I think we're discussing issues and topics that are, I think, extremely vital for where we are now as a country. Some of them are a bit maybe intense or difficult to think about, but you can't just turn away from the world and hope bad things don't happen. We're largely going to discuss your book, Conflict, which a lot of you might already have, and I know some of you just bought it now, which really details incredibly and wonderfully the evolution of warfare from World War II basically through today. What is it you hope people will get out of the book? Why did you feel it would need to be written? And I suppose, why is it so important for a broader American public and maybe just the public of the Western countries in general to have an idea of what's going on? Sorry, but why? I suppose, what do you want people to get out of it, and why did you feel it had to be written?
Stop right there.
Okay, sure.
Actually, first, let me just tell you how the book came about. So I knew Andrew Roberts. He's a brilliant historian and biographer in the UK. This is his 20th book. He's never done with a co-author before. And he called up after the Russians invaded Ukraine, and it's great to see the Consul General and Deputy Consul General of Ukraine here. Thanks, and Slava Ukraina. I go there, by the way, on Sunday. And I've actually done a lot of events with Andrew. I interviewed him 4 times in New York City alone on his Churchill book, which is renowned as the best one-volume biography of Churchill. George III book, The Last King of America. We did stuff around that. His book on Napoleon. By the way, he has a very dim view of the movie Napoleon. And on, Masters and Commanders, et cetera, et cetera. So he called up and said, hey, there is not a book that provides the military historical background for the war in Ukraine. How would you like to write one with me? And so I said it'd be terrific, because I had actually been looking for a vehicle to capture the military history of the 2 wars that I was privileged to command, Iraq and Afghanistan, and to revisit the subject of my PhD dissertation at Princeton, which was Vietnam and the lessons of that war. So nice bidding war, great advance, and all the rest of this stuff. And I remember we were doing it, HarperCollins won the book, and we did a video conference with them, and they said, so, okay, now how are you going to divvy up the writing responsibilities? And Andrew quickly said, well, General Petraeus is going to write about all the countries that he's invaded, plus Vietnam, and I'll fill in the rest. It was a wonderful collaboration. He's a delightful guy. He's also now Lord Roberts of Belgravia, that needy little district within London, known for its beautiful white townhouses. Actually, there are a lot of needy people in there, because about 1/3 of them are Russian, and they're stuck in Moscow because of personal sanctions. So we really had a great time doing this. I did, in fact, the Iraq and Afghanistan chapters, I did in the first person, so as opposed to the normal third person. But you asked, what do we really want people to take from it? And the really big idea of the book has to do with the importance, the paramount importance of the quality of strategic leadership in conflict. It's true of anything. It's true of business. It's true of nonprofits. It's true of whatever, your family. But when you're the strategic commander, the person at the very top, begins obviously with the President of the United States. He has to make a fundamental decision, but then it very quickly becomes the battlefield commander, the commander of forces in Iraq, commander of forces in Afghanistan. And I developed an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, having already been there as a 2-star as well. And it was when we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, distilled all the lessons that we needed to have learned but hadn't yet, and overhauled all aspects of our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officer education, the rehearsal exercises, the road to war, all of this. And I used this model, which has 4 tasks, explicitly during the surge and then subsequently in the other positions where I was the leader at the very top of an organization. The first task is that you have to get the big ideas right. You have to craft the right strategy. You have to, in conflict, you have to understand the enemy forces, your forces, the neighborhood, the geographic terrain, the human terrain, how the country is supposed to operate, how it really operates, on, in a very, very rigorous and granular manner, and craft the right strategy. This sounds easy. It should be, and of course these people who have 4 stars in their shoulder ought to be able to get this right. Well, we didn't get it right for 13 years in Vietnam. By the way, do we have any Vietnam veterans in here? Please stand up. Please stand up. The way we treated our Vietnam veterans was shameful. And yet they did more during the height of the war years in America to ensure that the great young men and women I was privileged to command in uniform came home to the kind of welcome that they should have gotten. So welcome home, and thank you for your service back when you were fighting a war that you didn't volunteer for, but often were drafted, although they're certainly volunteers, and fought very, very impressively. But those at the top failed until late 1968 to actually craft the right big ideas. It should have been about security of the people, and instead we made it into a war of attrition, search and destroy operations, a lot of indiscriminate use of air power and so forth, and the enemy could out-attrit us. So that was not, again, an example of getting the big ideas right. I'm going to pull this up and put it up. I'll pull it up by my mouth here. In other cases, the French got the big ideas horribly wrong when they built this big base, Dien Bien Phu, and they thought, finally the North Vietnamese, or actually it was still the Viet Minh communists at that point, they'll finally come to battle. And they did come to battle, and they licked them. So you got to get the big ideas right. Once you've got the big ideas right, you have to communicate them effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and to all other stakeholders. Now, in my case, that included America's mothers and fathers, those in the coalition countries. It obviously included the White House, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs, our Iraqi counterparts, and so forth. And then third, you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. And that's what we normally think of as leadership, actually. That is the inspiration provided by the leader, the example, the energy. It's hiring the best and brightest and hanging on to them as long as you can. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It is the organizational architecture you design. None of them are the same. We may have to switch. We're going to do an immediate action drill here in a second. Complicated. Okay, you can plug that in. Not at all. So there are other tasks in that third task as well. Identifying the right metrics. The body count in Vietnam was a terrible metric, and it also became corrupted over time. It lacked integrity. It should have been something about, because we couldn't kill our way out of that fight. Again, attrition, the enemy could out-attrit us. The metrics we had in Iraq had an awful lot to do with actually civilian loss of life, suicide attacks, just the sheer number of attacks. Certainly, we kept track of the enemy we killed, but that wasn't the be-all and end-all. In fact, one of the big ideas over here was that you can't kill or capture your way out of an industrial strength insurgency. You actually have to reconcile with some of those who have your blood on their hands. And we did, 103,000 of them. And we drove violence down by over 85% in the 18 months of the surge and gave Iraq a 3.5-year real tremendous opportunity. And then you also have in that third task your battle rhythm, how you spend your time. It's crucial. The way you drive the execution of a campaign plan actually is by the meetings that you do, going out, seeing it for yourself. I'd go on patrol with units twice a week, outside the wire, seeing what only you could do then, which is meeting Iraqi civilians, Iraqi security forces, business leaders, imams, you name it, and our own soldiers. And then there's a fourth task for which there are events on your battle rhythm to enable you to do it, which is where you have to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, make changes to the strategy as the situation evolves, as you make progress, as you experience setbacks, as you discover lessons that should have been learned before, but they're only learned when you actually incorporate them into big ideas, communicate them effectively, implement them, oversee the implementation, and then refine it. And you do it again and again and again. And that process really does work. And we examine this in each of these chapters of the book. And I'll note that this works in the civilian world too. In fact, I like to use Netflix. Reed Hastings, I think, is one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jack Ma of Alibaba and Jeff Bezos of Amazon, who, from starting something quite small, built it into something really extraordinary. So I'll very quickly, there are 4 big ideas generally that can tell you how Netflix evolved. The first big idea was to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So they're going to undercut Blockbuster. And I see enough people in this room of my generation or so that actually remember what a brick and mortar Blockbuster was. And I want to assure you there is still one left in America. It's in Bend, Oregon. It's a famously contrarian place that refuses to allow its Blockbuster to die. And you and I can take our grandkids out there and show them what we used to do on a Friday night. Anyway, that was the first big idea. You know, he communicates it, he oversees the implementation, goes, great, they're down. Okay, how are we doing? Well, Blockbuster's going out of business, but everybody else is doing what we're doing. So what do we do now? And he recognized that the context had changed. Broadband speeds had accelerated dramatically. So he said, now we're going to have people download movies. So that was the new big idea. They worked through that. The third big idea was the breakout moment. That's when he decided we're going to make our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, all these other iconic series that we binged on during the early months of the pandemic and so forth. And then the fourth big idea was we're going to make major motion pictures. We're going to go head to head with the major studios. In fact, he bought not one, but 2 major motion picture studios and did so well. Great metric. They got more Academy Award nominations 3 years ago or 4 years ago than any other major motion picture service in the world. Now, I've sat down with him. I've talked through this intellectual construct that I described, and he has something very, very similar. He's a really brilliant leader. He wrote this wonderful book, No Rules, Rules, as well. And I said, you know, there was one issue in the implementation of that fourth big idea, making your own major movies. Brad Pitt just doesn't play General Stan McChrystal, my close friend. We were 5 years in combat together. He just doesn't get Stan McChrystal. And I said, you know, Stan doesn't march around like a little toy soldier and salute stiffly and have no sense of humor. And I said, beyond that, I just couldn't believe that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. So that's what we really want readers to take from this, because we then apply that in just about every one of these different conflicts that we look at. And it's interesting because in some cases you actually have parts of it that are really pretty impressive, like when we did the fight to Baghdad and toppled Saddam's regime, or the invasion of Afghanistan, where, you know, a handful of special forces on horseback and some CIA officers with footlockers of money with warlord tribes and a lot of air power took down the Taliban and eliminated the Al-Qaeda sanctuary that was in eastern Afghanistan where the 9/11 attacks were planned. But then, actually, in each of those cases, the subsequent big ideas were inadequate. Remember, we really didn't have a great plan for what would follow in Iraq. We had a set of assumptions which were all invalidated. You know, basically that you lop off the top, you take down Saddam, his sons, his henchmen, and everybody else stays in place, and everybody will be happy about that. Well, number one, they didn't stay in place. And number two, there was incredible wrangling over who was now going to run the country. And then we compounded that by 2 horribly bad ideas The first of which was to fire the Iraqi military without telling them how we were going to enable them to provide for their families. So you have hundreds of thousands of military-age males with weapons and training who we have just given an incentive to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support that. That flunked one of the big ideas that was always on the wall staring at me, which a question that asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? And if the answer to that was no, in other words, you're going to create more bad guys because the way you do this operation, then you take off the street, you're not supposed to do the operation. So re-examine it. Sometimes you just say, go sit under a tree until the thought passes. So again, that flunked that. And then the other one, where they fired basically the bureaucrats that we actually needed, many of them Western educated, some of them drank. I mean, what more could you want in a Muslim country? And we fired all of them, along with, yes, the ones above them, when we needed them to run a country we really didn't understand. So we flubbed that. We fooled around for a year and a half or so. Finally, we put in an embassy, finally got a competent commander, got the right organizational architecture. It's moving along well. And then in 2006, that strategy was invalidated by a horrific event in which Sunni extremists, Al-Qaeda, bombed one of the most sacred Shia shrines in Iraq in a Sunni predominant area and set off a cycle of violence that just reached terrifying heights. And you had to do the surge. And George W. Bush, very, very courageous. The military was not generally in favor of the surge, with the exception maybe of one three-star general at that time who was about to become the four-star and command it. So again, this issue of strategic leadership is absolutely central. And we go through the book repeatedly looking at that and examining the quality of the leaders, first at the very, very top, at the level of, again, a president, a prime minister, President Zelensky in Ukraine, for example, and so forth, or Vladimir Putin. It's quite a contrast. The problem there is that even though the Russians have screwed up an awful lot of things, at the end of the day, they have more than 3 times the population of Ukraine and an economy that's probably 10 times the size. And they have an American partner right now that is spinning its wheels in the House of Representatives instead of passing the legislation that would get them the assistance that they need.
And we'll turn to Afghanistan next, but maybe just in line with what you're discussing. The 4 major vital elements for strategic leadership. Number
Tasks.
1, you said get the big one right.
Get the big ideas right.
And part of that you mentioned is, to begin with, determine or at least be willing to evolve to know what type of war you are in or you might end up in, whether it's a conventional war, a hybrid war, insurgency. We got that wrong in Vietnam. The French got it wrong too.
Yep.
You mentioned in Iraq and Afghanistan, we got it wrong to a degree for the first few years. You mentioned your PhD. You was all about Vietnam, the lessons we should be learning from there. There were maybe lone voices, but how hard was it for you to push back, say, especially against Secretary Rumsfeld and others, to say this is not working? We have to do something different. How did you get the administration to make that huge mindset change in terms of what sort of war is being fought?
Well, first of all, they saw that the area that I was commanding as a 2-star with the great 101st Airborne Division was actually going well. And it's because we had the right big ideas. And we actually, and I'd been a student of counterinsurgency as going back to my, West Point as a lieutenant. I devoured all these books about the French and Indochine and Algeria and then the U.S. and Vietnam and all that. And then I served in Central America for a summer, but got to see the comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign in El Salvador, which was really very good and well executed, and we had great partners. I was the chief of the force operations for the UN force in Haiti as a colonel. I spent a year in Bosnia as a 1-star, where we actually were doing high-value target operations, war criminals, and then subsequent to 9/11, we did the first counterterrorism operations before even Afghanistan. It was very quiet. But we had all the other elements of a very comprehensive civil, but we had all the NGOs to do it with as well. And then, of course, in the early days in Iraq. And so eventually, as a 3-star, after my 3-star tour, what happened, I actually had a great relationship with Rumsfeld, really good. I was a fellow Princetonian. He was very proud of his time at Princeton. I pushed back on him as a one-star from Bosnia when we were talking about war criminals and terrorists, and he never screwed with me again. And he just kept calling my number. So, I come home from Bosnia a year, okay, back, you're into Iraq as a 101st Airborne Division commander. And he would come up and see what we were doing. And again, it's going really well in an area that was historically really tough. Mosul is where every sectarian, tribal, and political fault line runs in the Middle East. You've got Sunni, Shia, Kurds, Turkmen, Yazidis, Shabak, Arabs, Christians of different flavors who don't even get together. All of this in that one, it's the ultimate melting pot in Iraq. And in Mosul city itself, over 2 million people, and then the province quite large as well. And then I came home from that. I've been home for 6 weeks. He says, get back over there, go examine how the train and equip program is going, because it had failed. It had been quite a disaster on the battlefield, except in our old area. I came back, I gave him a set of recommendations. He said, go back over and implement them. So now I go back over as a 3-star. But then he extends that tour from 12 to 15 and a half months. At the end of that, he says, I want you to come home through Afghanistan and tell me what you see over there. That was an interesting one because I tried to frame Afghanistan. I was supposed to look at the train and equip mission. And I found out it's way behind where we were because we had focused so completely on Iraq after the early toppling of the Taliban. But I came back and I said, Afghanistan is going to be the longest of the long wars. And his eyebrows went up because the level of violence there was vastly lower than that in Iraq and vastly lower for quite a period of time. But we squandered that period of time. And I laid out a comparison of Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq had money, Afghanistan did not. Iraq had literacy, Afghanistan did not. Iraq, generally the forces were inside the country. There weren't too many sanctuaries outside. Afghanistan, Taliban and Haqqani Network and all these others were all lodged over in Pakistan, and you couldn't go after them, and the Pakistanis wouldn't go after them either. Afghanistan has serious terrain, the Hindu Kush Mountains. Iraq has a few rivers and some cities. All these different comparisons. Iraq has lots of infrastructure, strong history of central government. Afghanistan has neither of those, even though they're trying to have strong central government. So it was very interesting, and he took that. There were just some stunners in that one. I remember I went to visit the police training, and I would always ask, lay out all the training schedules. It was a 6-week or 8-week course. And I looked at the training schedule and I said, there's something missing here. It was being done by contractors. Oh, what's that, General? I said, shooting. These police are going to go out and be policemen they're going to be in a counterinsurgency campaign. Well, sir, we don't have time for that. Well, I said, but you have time on the schedule to march an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening. I mean, what are we trying to do? Produce the old guard here or actual police that can function in a counterinsurgency? So they changed that. And then we found out that the metric that they had was wrong. They were counting all the individuals that they'd trained. So that's always going up. It's really reassuring. I said, have you ever looked at what you have actually in the ranks? Because, there's casualties, there's AWOLs, there's injuries, there's end of tour, end of service, and so forth. And we found out they were actually losing ground each week at the number that they were training. So it was quite a stunner, actually. And went back, and then I was in the place that was called the Engine of Change for our Army, and that's where we did the counterinsurgency field manual, all these other tasks I was talking about, and then got to go back. But during that time, I had very good ties with some key people in the White House. And I remember one time I was asked, what would you need if you were to go back over? And I'd been told I was probably going to go back over in the summer of 2007. I ended up going back in February. And I said, everything you got. And by the way, everything you got is 5 Army Brigade combat teams, 2 Marine battalions, the Marine Expeditionary Unit, and there's going to be more that I'm going to ask for. And we got all of that and more. And George Bush was just extraordinary at that moment. He decided he's taking the war over from Rumsfeld. He replaces Rumsfeld with Gates, who is fantastic. You want to show what's important to you? Over here, remember your battle rhythm? His battle rhythm started every Monday morning with a secure video teleconference with us in Iraq, with the whole national security team around the table at 7:30. Nothing in Washington, the White House, ever starts before 9 or 10 in many White Houses. And here they are all, and they're prepared. Poor action officers that had to get up, and probably in Saturday night to start getting their bosses ready to brief the big boss. But again, that's how this worked out, and he kept calling my number, and he would call me back when I was in the one command that I wasn't at combat from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is where the headquarters was. But we were responsible for bases all around the country. About every 2 or 3 weeks, or two or 3 months, I'd get a call. Rumsfeld wants you to come. He wants to know what you're up to. Mm-hmm. And so it was really interesting. So we actually had a great relationship. But the key, I think, was you couldn't ever be intimidated by him. And if you pushed back and it was solid, he would respect that, and he had time for you.
And you mentioned how Bush really just came around and felt, I have to take leadership, I have to grasp this stuff on my own. Yep. Some people will say he was maybe the last chance for longer-term stability in Iraq. It required a lot longer dedication of Americans, and maybe in Afghanistan. But before we get to Afghanistan...
We actually got Iraq right, and we drove the violence down by over 85%. And it kept going down over the subsequent 3.5 years until, unwisely, we pulled out our last combat forces. And the Iraqis almost immediately, the prime minister pursued highly sectarian actions that tore the fabric of society apart that we had worked so hard to get stitches back into. And that then they took their eye off of the Islamic State, the outgrowth of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was able to reconstitute. And extremist elements, if you take your eye off them, they will come back. And by the way, that's an issue. If someone wants to ask about Hamas and Gaza later on, one of my concerns is, and I was just in Israel 3 weeks ago talking to the Minister of Defense and others, I'm concerned that it's not enough just to defeat them or destroy them. You actually have to have a plan for after that, or you see them coming back, as they are in Al-Shifa Hospital. They cleared Al-Shifa Hospital previously, and they just went back in and policed up hundreds more Hamas fighters, extremists, because they didn't hold it well. And we can talk about the clear, hold, and build, which is the essence, the 3 tasks, basically, of a counterinsurgency campaign.
And just to kind of finish with Iraq, part of the issue is Obama administration. Part of how he gets elected is campaign promises of pulling the U.S. back from Iraq and Afghanistan.
Iraq was the bad war.
He will say we could not get status forces agreements with the Iraqis for American troops to be able to stay there. That's debatable, or even if you need it in place. But if
he sent 5,000 troops back to Iraq without a status forces agreement by the end of
a few years later
to
take on ISIS.
Had to take
so
on
I mean, how many troops would have been needed to maintain the levels you had achieved with the surge, kind of in terms of stability?
Well, the real challenge, actually, to be fair, I mean, I thought we should have kept forces. The real issue was the prime minister of Iraq, who all of a sudden, with our combat forces out, our last 4-star gone, who is Lloyd Austin, by the way, now our Secretary of Defense, a very good man. He was the second of the 3 stars under me during the surge. The problem was that the prime minister is the one who was to blame for that, because he had a very good situation. The security forces were actually quite good by then. The security situation was good. They're making $110 billion a year from oil exports. All the trends are in the right direction. And he immediately, within 24 hours, issues an arrest warrant for the senior Sunni politician, of course, the government Shia majority, who was the vice president, and his security detail. And then he went after the Minister of Finance, a guy that I signed a letter saying he had no blood on his hand at one point in time, and then another major Sunni politician from Anbar province. And it just set the Sunni community off. They then had big demonstrations. The security forces focused on that for an extended period. That created more friction between Sunni and Shia, because the military forces were predominantly Shia, as they should be in a country that's 60% Shia. And then Al-Qaeda was able to reconstitute as the Islamic State, and you know how that, and 2 years later you have the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate. So that really was the proximate cause. I did believe we should have kept troops there. The prime minister was willing to sign the letter himself, but we wanted a parliamentary approved status of forces agreement, which I thought was too high a bar, and it proved to be. But it really is on the prime minister to be fair in that case, although President Obama certainly he'd never had any fondness for Iraq, but we set him up really well with the surge, because he had a nice glide path for withdrawing forces. And then Afghanistan, which was supposed to have been the good war, when it actually push came to shove, we never really got everything that we needed. It took us 9 years to get the inputs right in Afghanistan. And by inputs, I'm talking about not just the right big ideas, which General McChrystal got right about the 8-year mark, but also almost the right level of forces. He didn't give us all that we asked for. The right leaders, you got to get the right people in there that have a disposition for this kind of thing, the right organizational architecture. It took far too long to do that. The right preparation of the forces, the right number of diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, and others. And we finally got it right about 6 months into my time as the commander when I replaced General McChrystal. But we only kept it that way for 6 months. And the president had actually done something that was just astonishing to me, which was to announce the drawdown date for when we're going to start drawdown in the speech that announced the buildup. You know, you're in a contest of wills with an enemy who believes that you may have the watches, but he has the time, and you have to convince him otherwise. And we failed to do that, frankly. So a lot of interesting dynamics there.
And kind of bookending the beginning of the war and the end of the war, as mentioned, halfway through, you're one of the few people who said this is going to be our longest war. 20 years, do you think we should have actually negotiated with the Taliban in the beginning when they were, after the initial invasion, when they were on the run? Do you think anything could have been achieved then?
It's possible. That way, I do note in the book that at least you have to debate whether or not we should have tried to be more open with the government that we formed and try to bring in some of them. But at the end, we were in a position of weakness, and we should never have been negotiating in that situation. The truth is that Afghanistan was sustainable. We had 3,500 troops on the ground, if you count everything that we possibly had, 15,000, 17,000 contractors, but they're all safe and secure and helping the Afghans to maintain the overly sophisticated helicopters that we insisted on sending them. But again, 3,500 troops, we hadn't lost a soldier in combat in 18 months at the end until that terrible suicide bombing at Abbey Gate at the Kabul International Airport. We could have easily sustained that. And then the cost by that point in time was $25 billion, far, far less than what it was, and a defense budget of $800 billion. So, and it was predictable what was going to happen. And I said it would be. I said I feared a total collapse of the Afghan security forces the minute they learned that no one was coming to the rescue. Because the way you had set up the defense of Afghanistan, it's the only possible way you could do it, is you have modestly trained and equipped soldiers and police securing the major urban areas, the major population centers and critical infrastructure. And when they get hit by the Taliban, coming out of their sanctuaries in Pakistan, then you bring in the commandos, for whom we had terrific helicopters, except that they couldn't maintain them. We should have kept going with the Russian ones that I insisted on buying while I was the commander, which they could fix and were very simple. They were basically analog versus the digital ones. But they would get on the helicopters, 35,000 strong, well-equipped, well-trained, good fighters. By the way, the stuff that the Afghans wouldn't fight, that's nonsense. They fought like devils out there. They were really, really great fighters, except when they know nobody's coming to rescue them. And what happened is, as the contractors pulled out with our troops, the operational readiness degraded very quickly, and all of a sudden, the troops out in the front line realized there's nobody coming to the rescue, which is the whole concept. And then, we had forced the Afghan government to release 5,500 Taliban as part of the deal, which was also insane. And they went right back into the fight. They weren't supposed to, but of course that's what they did. So here you have the ability of the Taliban to hit in multiple places at one time, and pretty quickly the Afghan security forces got overwhelmed. We could have sustained that. And look, we have tens of thousands of troops in Korea. Yes, they're not getting killed, but none of our soldiers have been killed for 18 months either, because we were not on the front lines. We were advising, assisting, and enabling, as well as training and equipping.
Related to South Korea, we've had average 30,000, 40,000 American troops there for about 70 years.
Yep.
Many more thousands in Europe for 80 plus years.
Yep.
Is some of it just
in Japan?
In Japan, is some of it just the will of the American people? It was a Democratic President Obama who started the trend towards withdrawal. President Trump negotiated with the Taliban for the withdrawal agreement, and President Biden agreed to maintain that plan, adjusted by a few months.
Yep.
But do you think they all were reflecting the will of the American people, or maybe the American people didn't even know the realities on the ground?
I really didn't detect an awful lot of people that were constantly saying we must end the endless wars. In all honesty, again, that was more of a political thing. You don't have to end endless wars if they're sustainable. And again, the situation in Afghanistan, as frustrating and maddening and fraught as it was incomparably better than what we could anticipate would happen, and did actually happen. And oh, by the way, the other thing we warned about is if the Taliban comes back, you better be on the lookout for Islamist extremists coming back as well. And of course, it's the Islamic State Khorasan group, which is the branch of the Islamic State in the greater Central and South Asia area, centered on Afghanistan, but in other countries as well. It was those forces that actually carried out the operation in Moscow, and they were actually detained in several other areas also. So that's real reach. And again, keep in mind that the last time that Al-Qaeda had a real sanctuary there, they carried out the 9/11 attacks. That's where the first training was conducted of the attackers.
Relating to Moscow and obviously Putin's initial war on Ukraine in 2014, annexing Crimea, and then starting a war in Donbass. You have been to Ukraine many times. You've been there in the last year. You've been in Kyiv while it's been under attack. You've met the highest political, military, and intelligence leaderships of the country. Where do you see the war in terms of what we should know, and where do you think it can go?
So years ago, I have an academic past as well. I've taught at, I think, 6 different universities over the years. And I taught economics during part of that time, both international relations and economics. And when you're in an economics class, you begin every answer to every question with the words, "it depends." And in this case, it really does depend. In fact, I just did a piece for foreignpolicy.com that asked my view, where do you see things going in Ukraine? And the title is, "It depends." Depends first and foremost on whether the U.S. assistance comes quickly to a theater near us, and it's vital, because they're really rationing artillery rounds and so forth. And we're the only country with the industrial strength scale that can really provide what they need, and it is absolutely vital. It also depends, though, on Ukraine resolving its conscription issues. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier on the front lines is over 40 years. The average age of the soldiers in the front lines when I was a commander was 18 to 21. And it's just a different approach. The concept is that we want people to complete their education, start a family, maybe have some kids, and then at the age of 27, they start to look at them for actual conscription, not just volunteers. And so this is a tough topic, and I know the Consul General appreciates this. The Parliament there is really struggling with this. It's the one issue that President Zelensky will not answer in a Q&A. He just talked, we're working on it. But they've got to resolve that, because the Russians have figured out how to continue to generate more forces. They don't train them very well. They don't equip them very well. They've lost more tanks in the past 2 years than they had when the war started. They just bring more out of mothballs that had operational when the war started. By the way, this is an incredible service for NATO, and there are no NATO troops fighting on the front lines other than some volunteers from different countries. So, our men and women aren't dying in Ukraine. It's Ukrainians fighting their war of independence, and we should help them do that as quickly as we can. Then it depends also, a huge game changer would be if there is a formula to free up the $300+ billion of Russian assets that are frozen in Western banks. That would be incredible. Right now, what they're going to do is give Ukraine the several billion dollars that are the interest on that money, and that will be helpful. But again, that would be a real game changer and enable them in a very important way. It depends on continued European support, but that's been rock solid. I was at the Munich Security Conference this year, unlike any Munich Security Conference I've ever been to, and I started going when I was a speechwriter for the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Normally, the Americans are serious. We're chiding the Europeans to do more. This year, the Europeans are serious. The EU had just chalked up another $50 billion in contributions collectively, and each country individually is providing a lot. Leaders were all out there. They're all doing agreements, security agreements, and so forth. And the Americans were the ones that needed the reminder that there's a war on and that Congress has to move on this action, which was approved by the Senate months ago and languishing in this very dysfunctional House of Representatives that we have. There's a number of other factors. Technology breakthroughs would be another. One of the real successes that Ukraine has achieved, not well known, is they have used a combination of very advanced maritime drones and aerial drones to destroy about a third of the Russian Black Sea fleet. Now, this is crucial. It forced them to withdraw most of their ships from the port of Sevastopol on the west coast of Crimea, and that means that the western Black Sea is now open for the Ukrainians to export wheat, other grains, and iron ore and so forth. And this is crucial for Egypt's food security and crucial for the Ukrainian fiscal situation. It's billions of dollars for them. So that's in the Russian Black Sea fleet, they can't replace the ships because there's something called the Montreux Convention, which prevents warships from going through the Bosphorus, which is of course controlled by Turkey, to replace the losses that they have. So they're just, a third of their fleet is on the bottom of the Black Sea. So a number of all these factors, but the real issue is a combination of forced generation, Ukrainians, and robust American support.
And my colleagues are collecting those question cards, and just while they're getting them up to me, maybe one last question that is very understandably concerning to all Americans or the entire world, obviously, is Vladimir Putin's repeated, use of direct and sometimes tacit, sometimes not so subtle nuclear threats. Can you talk about that and what that has done for the war? But maybe the flip side of it is nuclear blackmail. If you give in to Putin here, then do the Chinese say, we're going to nuke Taiwan unless you give it to us? How do you keep that balance when it's such an obviously incredibly dangerous issue?
Well, he's rattling the nuclear saber just to try to scare people. He was doing it in particular at a time when the battlefield was going very badly for them. They lost the Battle of Kyiv. They had to withdraw all their forces. The Ukrainians won. The Ukrainians won the Battle of Kharkiv, the second largest city, although it still gets pounded because it's so close to the border. Sumy, Chernihiv, Kharkiv Oblast or province, they cleared all of that. Kherson, west of the Dnipro River, cleaned that up. So again, in those times, he was trying to do anything to try to rattle the Allies, to try to drive a wedge between Europe and America, between East and West Europe, and so forth. But it lacked credibility. It's not that easy to use tactical nuclear weapons, especially when the wind tends to blow toward your country instead of the other one. But it has a tactical effect, and he knows. And then a lot of diplomacy, but the Chinese and Indian leaders, the President Xi and Prime Minister Modi, both publicly told Putin, don't do it. And so they'll continue to rattle this, again, just to try to instill fear. And it did for a while. I think we probably were not as forward-leaning as we should have been with certain weapon systems because of a fear that it could lead to escalation until we sort of sorted that out and realized that was very unlikely.
But like you mentioned, I suppose promising consider, despite obviously the intensity of relations between the U.S. and China over the last many years, at this level, even if it was relatively quiet, there was cooperation and more cooperation from President Modi in India. That's a successful sign, hopefully, right?
Well, you mean Prime Minister
in terms of pushing back to make Putin reconsider any thought he might
absolutely.
have.
I mean, that's why it's one of the principal reasons. Those are two, China is a partner, a partnership supposedly without limits, but they have had limits. And then India is one of the consumers of Russian oil at quite substantial amounts. So when those two, and India is also a member of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and a leader of the global South, if you will. So again, just not a very effective threat, although it did cause a lot of concern at the time.
Okay.
And I went on CNN, actually, on the Sunday show, and right after that first threat, and they said, so General, what could we possibly do in return? And I said, well, we could put together a coalition of the willing that would destroy every major Russian weapon system in Ukraine and also in Crimea and on the Black Sea. And actually, I was told later by someone in a very high place in the White House, he said, that is an option. And thank you for putting it on CNN. Not sure it would be the option, but again, it certainly is.
A few questions in a similar vein, but this one, I suppose, encapsulates it. Rob asks, How would you describe Americans' foreign policy interests today? What are our key interests? And what does America First mean to you in terms of a global strategy?
Well, America First tends to smack of isolationism because that was the rallying cry of those isolationists prior to the entry into World War II, prior to Pearl Harbor. And you had some quite distinguished people there. You had Charles Lindbergh, a movie star looks and the first man to cross the Atlantic in a plane alone. And I think it's short-sighted, as is any kind of isolationism. Again, the world needs U.S. leadership. And by the way, that's why World Affairs Councils are so important, because I think those that gather in these are reminded, the reason that we do this is not for charity. It's because it's in our own cold, hard national security interest and our economic interest. The rules-based international order, such as it is, with all its shortcomings and imperfections and flaws, is just incomparably better than the alternative. Keep in mind that the other guys, our adversaries out there, are trying to make the world safe for autocracy, and we're trying to make the world safe generally for democracy. And let me just point out here, actually, that I think that the U.S. and our Western allies face the greatest number of threats and the greatest complexity of those threats since at least the end of the Cold War, if not the end of World War II. If you think of the U.S. as the guy in the circus with some help from allies and partners, keeping a lot of plates spinning, you get the idea. The China plate's the biggest and the most important. It's bigger than all the others. We can't let that wobble. But obviously the Russian plate is much more menacing and dangerous now. There's still a North Korea plate. There are at least 3 Iranian plates, their nuclear program, the support to Shia militia in the region, and their missile and drone program, which both threatens our allies and partners there and also are being provided to Russia to use in Ukraine. You have individual plates representing Islamist extremist groups. As I mentioned earlier, you have to keep an eye and pressure on them or they'll get bigger. They'll reconstitute just the way that the Islamic State did in Iraq after the Iraqis took their eye off them and it went into Syria and the Syrian civil war. There are plates that represent various manifestations of climate change, more intense weather, worse fires, all of this, that desertification of the Sahel that is pushing millions of people into Europe and then in some cases all the way, of course, across our southern border, which we obviously have to focus more on. There are plates representing various cyber threats, which are ever more diabolically clever and destructive. So again, this list goes on, and then domestic populism. You see it in Mexico, you see it in Hungary, you see it to a degree now in the Czech Republic, and so on. You saw it in Warsaw. Thankfully, that lost in a democratic election. And frankly, we have a little bit of domestic populism here ourselves, I suspect also. So again, think of that world. It needs U.S. leadership. And if we don't lead, there is nobody else who is going to step up. The reason that everybody else left Afghanistan when we did was because they can't stay there without us. They actually had more than twice the number of troops that we had on the ground. They wanted to stay. We could have stayed. And when we decided to pull out, again, when I heard President Biden announce the decision that he was going to follow through with what President Trump agreed, I said publicly, I think on CNN or Fox, that I believe we're going to come to regret this decision, and I believe we have. Look at what has happened with the Taliban. The country is in economic freefall. Half the population is starving. Another half of the population can't do anything meaningful outside the house without a male guardian. Those that worked for us, with us, in the government are all being pursued and in many cases killed. Extremists are back in Afghanistan and sanctuaries are there and so forth. So I think all of that was predictable. Some of us did predict it publicly. It did come to pass, and we need to learn a lesson from that.
Interesting question here, but maybe I would just kind of parlay it into your overall ideas and thoughts and insights into the future of warfare. Vijay asks, just to summarize it, imagine if the American president suddenly gets bitten by a mosquito bite, but then realizes actually a tiny flea-sized drone that's injected a toxin in the president's neck. Is that unrealistic, or is that just where we might be going down the line? And maybe more broadly, if you can talk about the role of drones, of AI,
Sure. Yep.
of all of these new theaters of war that we hadn't considered, 20, 30 years ago.
These are still relatively evolutionary in operation on the battlefield in Ukraine, but they are evolving very, very rapidly. They're not quite revolutionary, but they're getting there. Some of the drones that we had and so forth really were revolutionary in certain respects. When we went back into Iraq, we didn't go back in to fight the Islamic State ourselves. We went back in to perform what's called advise, assist, and enable operations. And the Iraqis did the fighting on the front lines. And we provided the drones, we provided precision munitions, we provided intelligence fusion, we provided intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance assets, all of this. And that is transforming how we fight in those instances. This very simplistic idea about the future of war is that we will, over time, replace what is essentially a small number of large platforms that are incredibly capable, also incredibly expensive and very heavily manned. Think of an aircraft carrier, surface combatants, M1 tank, F-35, and so forth. We're going to replace those because they're increasingly vulnerable with a vast number, an extraordinary number of unmanned systems that in many cases are not even remotely piloted anymore, but will be algorithmically driven. And the human in the loop will be the human who actually determines what the algorithm is, what are the instructions you give, what are the conditions the machine has to meet with all of its incredible capabilities. And it's going to be learning all the time too, because it'll have AI enabling. But there will come a time where there is not going to be somebody on a joystick sitting at an airbase in Nevada, which is where a lot of our drones are flown from. It's going to be doing it on its own. And in certain cases, it can be doing with swarms of drones. And this is not just in the air. You're going to have it on the ground, you're going to have it on the sea, you're going to have it in cyberspace. We already really do in large measure. In outer space and subsea, which is the last domain where there's still an ability to hide far better than most other places above the surface of the water. That's going to be really transformational, and we need to accelerate the process of that, because that's how the way you deter China is you ensure that the potential adversary's assessment of your forces and your willingness to use them is rock solid, and you can't have any doubt about that.
You mentioned just because of the inherent speeds of reaction times, milliseconds that a computer can make a decision, humans are going to be taken out of the loop in terms of, on the battlefield, out there adapting, finding targets, doing whatever. How concerned are you about either A, that those algorithms go wrong,
Sure.
or that when those systems are learning progressively on their own, that they go to some kind of horrific level we hadn't even anticipated, and we no longer have control of them?
I mean, these are actually theoretically possible. I'm sure that some of the former of what you described will take place. The latter, I'm a little less, I think that's a bit more futuristic in certain respects. But no, and by the way, you can't keep the human in the loop at a certain point in time, because if the other guy doesn't have a human in the loop, his machine will be faster than your machine. I mean, a human cannot operate at the speed that these machines will be able to operate. We already do this, actually. If you think about the advanced, say, Patriot missile systems, and these, you determine that your weapon's free, and it basically, the machine is now going to determine when it launches its interceptor to, again, you're trying to hit a bullet with a bullet in many cases. And the way you do that is the human gets out of that loop at that point in time.
And before these last two questions, I'll just combine them. They're great questions from students, which is always my favorite. I think one's maybe teacher as well. But again, if you're interested, we have General Petraeus has kindly signed all the books we have, so they are at the back. And if you will, bear with us when we finish. I just have to get them out through the backstage, so that's why we're taking off that way.
But that's where, by the way, the development officer will be standing up front. If you want to go that way with me, get your checkbook out.
You have to get through Sandia.
I'll be happy
That's
to
no easy task.
Share a free glass of wine with you right after this. So, by the way, I should have mentioned, the one delightful thing about my co-author, Lord Roberts of Belgravia, is that he can do something I just cannot do. and that is he can drink before speaking and still be coherent. If I have so much as a drop of something, I recognize that that was a bad idea. So,
and lastly, before these are great questions to conclude on, in terms of America's role in the world, what we face going forward. Someone you know well, if you can come on April 30th, we're hosting retired Admiral Davidson. His last command was as the 25th commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So that is the person whose territorial responsibility was from India all the way across for most of the Pacific. I'm not trying to be alarmist, but if things went south with regards to Taiwan and China, this is the person who would have been at the front of that command, same way you were for Central Command. Look out for that. In terms of policy perspective and how you present it to the United States public, May 22nd, we're going to host former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, who was a State Department spokesperson, I think, before the White House. And then lastly, a lot of you knew him. Houston's very own will be discussing, for me, probably maybe the best all-around foreign policy president since FDR. We're hosting acclaimed and best-selling historian and author John Meacham for his upcoming book on George H.W. Bush, Bush 41. So look out for that in June. Just to finish with these two good questions, one, they didn't put a name, but I think it's from a student my colleagues wrote on here. With recruitment levels declining, multiple strategies, wars, and everything, and your professional opinion, how can America return to the world stage economically and militarily?
Stop right there.
Sure.
One question at a time.
Well, they're very similar. That's the reason I would say them.
Well, let's just hold on
okay,
that
sure.
one for a
Okay.
second. If you stack questions up, then you have to stack answers up.
Okay.
First of all, we have some recruiters right here in the audience. Stand up, please. Where are you?
So Major Hoyt, are you still here?
There he
thank
is.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the reason I wanted him to stand up is because the Army in particular, which is one of the services that has fallen short of its recruiting goals, has embarked on a whole bunch of innovative ideas. In fact, he's the embodiment of one of them. There's 2 test cases in America. One's in LA, one is in Houston. And they're basically out looking to recruit future commissioned officers, either going to the service academies or ROTC programs or whatever in a very novel way. And they're doing the same with recruiting of enlisted forces. In fact, one of the initiatives that I really like is one where we find the individual and you say, you're probably concerned that you won't pass the PT test, physical training test. And as I look at you, you're probably right. But have we got a deal for you? There's a pre-basic training that you can go to. We're going to help you get in the best shape of your life, and then you can go to basic training and be assured that you're going to be able to pass everything. So there's a whole bunch of novel ideas like this, and I suspect, paying them a bit more as Congress actually did. They inched up the pay and so forth, and they deserve it. Soldiering is still an outdoor sport. And in a day when many people increasingly sit behind screens all day, and they deserve what they get.
And related to that, Major Hoyt, if you don't mind me volunteering you to any of you high school or college students might have any questions, but ever thought about the military, the Army in particular? He'll be at the back of the room. In particular, I know we've got some great students from the Audi International School, Lutheran South Academy. I'm not sure where the schools are here tonight. But in that vein, in line with the previous question, Evelyn and Ian from the Lutheran South Academy asked, how can we as civilians do our part to support the military endeavors of our country?
Vote for people who will enable that to be done. Seriously. So look, let me bring this to a close if I could. I was privileged to preside over the largest re-enlistment ceremony in military history, and it was in a war zone. It was in Baghdad at the 18-month mark of the surge. All the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and airmen who were there in front of me had been in combat. Most of them, it was at least their second tour. Some it was even already their third tour. They knew that by re-enlisting, they were going to go home for a year or whatever and then be right back in a war zone, either Iraq, which was still at quite substantial levels, or Afghanistan, which was expanding. And I was the re-enlistment officer. I recited the oath. They repeated it after me. A massive sea of 1,215 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. ironically in one of Saddam's old palace cupolas. And even the New York Times put this on the front page above the fold the next day. But as I was reciting the oath and as they were repeating it after me, I was wondering, what is this all about? It's not for the stock options. The economy in July of 2008, we didn't know that we were on the precipice of the Great Recession, but it was actually still quite robust. From our vantage point, it seemed like the re-enlistment rate or the unemployment rate was very low, et cetera. So there were lots of opportunities outside, and yet there they were. And I realized there were three elements. Number one was they're serving our nation at a time of war. And oh, by the way, we're winning this thing. We've driven violence down by nearly 90% at that point in time. They feel very proud to have been part of that, to have pulled a country out of a sectarian civil war. So the privilege of serving a mission larger than self in uniform is pretty special. The second is that you're privileged to do it with others who actually feel the same way. And that's incredibly special as well. And then the third was that they knew that the Americans back home appreciated what they were doing, even if they disagreed with the policies that we were implementing. Thank you for your service and so forth. And when I think of our country, and I think of the places that most did that number three observation, Houston comes to mind. You have been incredibly supportive of and generous to our men and women in uniform, our veterans, and their families. And for that, I want to say thank you each, and thanks for the privilege of being with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Will you all please join me in thanking General Petraeus for tonight, but mostly for his decades of service to our nation. Thank you.